Okay, so last time we started talking about animals, right? And we talked about the characteristics of animals, correct? And we said that the definition of animals is they are a multicellular eukaryotic heterotroph whose cells lack cell walls, right? And then we talked about the reasons why animals are multicellular. Remember, we talked about surface area to volume ratio and how that limits the size of cells. And then, hold on. All right. So multicellular, remember surface area to volume ratio. So if you have a large surface area to volume ratio, that means diffusion can happen fast enough and the cell survives. Small surface area to volume ratio, cell doesn't survive. Okay, and then we talked about symmetry, okay, features that you find in animals, and one of those is symmetry. So I'm going to practice looking at different kinds of symmetry, and you can tell me what each of these types of symmetry are. So here's your first one. What type is that? Radial, good. Bilateral, good. Bilateral. There's only one way to divide that in half.
Bilateral.
Bilateral.
Radial.
Bilateral. So if you imagine the frog, like if you're looking at its back, right? That it would be bilateral. One way to divide it in half. How about this one?
Radial.
Radial. Good. Radial. Good.
Radial.
Actually, this is a sponge. This is our topic for today. Okay, and sponges are actually asymmetrical. Okay, so sponges are unique in the animal kingdom because they do not have any symmetry. There's no way to divide them in half and get mirror images. So if you're to divide them in half this way, do you have a mirror image? Yes. That is one sponge. So are those mirror images? No. Is that a mirror image? No. That way? No. No. No mirror image. Okay. So sponges are asymmetrical. Okay. No way to divide them in half. They're unique in the animal kingdom in the fact that they have no symmetry. Okay. They're unique for other reasons, but one of the reasons why they are unique is because they are non-symmetrical. No symmetry. Fun fact of the day, sponges can actually house 16,000 other animals inside of a single sponge. Okay, so there's actually, at one time, there's actually these little teeny tiny shrimp that are about the size of a grain of rice, and live inside the sponge's cavities. Okay, so here's a piece of an actual real sea sponge. Okay, see how there's like little channels and stuff inside of that sponge? You have little tiny shrimp that will live inside of here. And they actually have a social structure that's very similar to bees. So you'll have like the queen shrimp and the protector shrimp and all sorts of different kinds of shrimp. And they'll all live as a colony inside of a little sponge. There's other types of animals that will live in sponges as well, but that's just one type. So you can have up to 16,000 animals. This is your corny science teacher joke for the day. Okay? So, have you ever wondered how deep the ocean would be without sponges? Because they absorb water, yes. So if you took out all the sponges, how deep would it be? Okay. Boo. All right. So, chapter 8, sponges. Sponges are in phylum Porifera. Okay, Porifera, which means pore bearer. Comes from the Greek word poros, meaning pore bearer, or passage. So sponges in phylum Porifera have lots and lots of pores, little tiny openings all over their body. There are lots of different species of sponges. There's about 8,000 different kinds of species that we'll find, and most of them are marine, but you will have some that are in fresh water. But for the most part, they're found in marine environments. All right? So they are the pore bearers. And the pores are actually microscopic. And I'll show you what those look like. Okay? Okay. So back when sponges were first discovered, people looked at them and they thought that they were plants because a sponge is sessile, meaning it doesn't move, so it stays attached to a surface. Okay, and if you poke a sponge, it's not going to respond, right? Sponges don't have brains, they don't respond. So people thought that they were plants, non-responsive. And it wasn't until like fairly recently that we actually discovered that they're actually animals. Okay? But they're very, very different from other animals. They're asymmetrical, but also they don't have a mouth or a digestive tract. Okay, so they have no mouth where they eat stuff, and they don't have a digestive tract where the food goes through and gets digested and absorbed. So no mouth or digestive tract like other animals, and they do not have tissue layers. So sponges actually have what we call a cellular level of organization. They do not have different kinds of tissues. They only have different kinds of cells. So when we look at cnidarian's neck cycle, you'll see they have 3 tissue layers, the endoderm, the ectoderm, and the mesoderm. So they actually have tissues. Sponges do not. And other animals will even have organ systems. Sponges don't. But because of this, sponges actually can do something really cool. They can do like an extreme form of fragmentation. So if you take a sponge and you put it through a sieve or like a cheese grater and put all of the pieces of that sponge that get made, each of those little tiny pieces can become a new sponge because they have a cellular level of organization. So all right, so sponges don't have tissues or even systems to carry out the essential functions that we talked about the last time I saw you. But they still have to carry out all of those essential functions like reproduction, okay, respiration, feeding, all of that stuff. How do they do it? Well, they do it with 4 kinds of cells. They carry out all of their essential functions with 4 different kinds of cells. Okay. The first kind of cell that you'll find is the epidermal cell. That is the flat cell that's found on the outside of the sponge. It's like the skin of the sponge. Okay, so when you look at a sponge, what you're seeing are the epidermal cells. And your skin is your epidermis, right? The outer layer of your skin is the epidermis. So it's like the skin of the sponge. Okay. Epidermal cells. You also have pore cells, okay, where water is brought into the sponge. Okay, these pore cells are how the sponges get their name, porifera, the little tiny openings. So on our picture here on the right, okay, these little cells that look like hexagons, those are the epidermal cells, and then these pink ones, okay, those are going to be your pore cells. So water is going to enter into the sponge through those little tiny pores. Do you see that? Okay. On the inside of the sponge, lining the inside, see these purple cells? Those are really cool cells called collar cells. Okay, and they have flagella and microvilli. Do you know what a flagella is? Yeah, it's like the whip-like tail. Okay, so they've got flagella and microvilli. And microvilli, here's a picture, a closer picture. Okay, so microvilli are the little extensions off of the cell. So, and then here's the pink thing right there. That is the flagella. Okay, so those line the inside of the sponge. Okay, and they beat their flagella. Okay, and as they beat their flagella, they actually move the water. Okay, so they move the water out of the sponge. And as they move the water out of the sponge, it creates a little bit of a vacuum and sucks water in through the pore cells onto the inside of the sponge. Does that make sense? Okay, so pulls the water in, okay, and moves the water. So the collar cells are responsible for the sponge's ability to move water. As that water comes in, okay, the water is carrying all sorts of things like phytoplankton, zooplankton, bacteria, dead stuff like detritus. All of that's coming into the cell, into the sponge. Okay, and those little microvilli, those little extensions off of the cell, as the water passes through there, all of those little microscopic things get caught in the microvilli, and then that collar cell engulfs those food particles and eats it. Okay, so the collar cells move the water through and then are also responsible for capturing the food for the sponge. Yes, make sense? Okay. The fourth kind of cell is an amoebocyte. Okay, this picture on the bottom left, this is what an amoeba looks like. Okay, that's an amoeba. An amoebocyte is an amoeba-like cell. So amoebas actually will They're kind of like blob-like cells, and they can create these things that are called pseudopods. So see these finger-like extensions off of the cell? They'll extend these pseudopods, so they'll stick out the pseudopod and then drag the rest of their body, the cell, to that pseudopod, and then stick it out and drag, and so they can move around by sticking out these pseudopods and kind of like blob-like moving over and through a sponge. They can also engulf food this way because they can stick out two pseudopods and surround the food and capture the food, okay, with those pseudopods. So the amoebocytes are pretty cool. They are kind of like the circulatory system of the sponge. So they pick up waste products from the cells of the sponge, and they take them away, and then they deliver nutrients and oxygen to the other cells of the sponge. Okay, so these amoebocytes that are moving around inside of the jelly-like interior of the sponge are delivering nutrients and oxygen and picking up waste products. Okay, so the amoebocytes are pretty important in what they do for the sponge. They also make these things that are called spicules, and spicules are the skeleton of the sponge. So spicules can be made out of silica or calcium carbonate. Okay, and so you'll have like these little spicules. Let's say they look like this. Okay, so spicules that get created by amoebocytes, they'll be connected by protein, and then your cells will live inside of this structure. Okay, so these spicules connected and create the lattice where all of the cells of the sponge sit inside. Okay, so this actually gives the sponge structure. Without these things, it would be a blob of cells on the seafloor. It would be pretty much pointless. Okay, so the spicules help to give the sponge structure. Here are pictures of spicules. Okay, so they can be made out of calcium carbonate or silica. Okay, here's some pictures of different kinds of spicules. Your siliceous spicules, okay, made out of silica. Silica is glass. Okay, so you actually have a kind of sponge that are called glass sponges because their spicules are made out of glass, silica. There's different shapes that the spicules can be, and we actually decide what species a sponge is based on its spicules. So if we have an unknown sponge, you can look at the spicules and figure out what species it is. Okay, that's what we look at.
By the way, do we still use sponges to make like?
Okay, so the sponge that I have that you're passing around, okay, what's left of that sponge, Davis, is just the skeleton, okay, and that's actually made out of spongin, that sponge right there. And so some sponges, their skeleton is made entirely of a protein called spongin. Okay, this would be what it would look like under the microscope. And so it's made out of spongin. So that is just simply the spongin skeleton that's being passed around. Okay, and when you get a sea sponge, if you bring it up from the sea floor, they set it out, let it dry out, and all the cells die, and then they rinse out the cells, and you're left with the skeleton, which is what people use in the bathtub. Okay, so that's just simply the skeleton of the sponge. Okay, so that's the skeleton. So water flows in. Okay, so the collar cells bring the water in through the pore cells, and then the water exits out through the opening at the top of the sponge, which is called the osculum. Okay, it's the large opening at the top. A sponge will either have just one large osculum at the top, or depending on the species of sponge, they can have more than one. Okay, but that's what they look like. So after the food gets brought into the sponge by the collar cells and gets captured by the collar cells, it gets engulfed by the collar cells. Okay, and then that food has two paths that it can take after that. So the collar cells themselves can eat the food and then digest the food and use it themselves, okay, for their own energy to keep on pumping water. Or after it engulfs the food, it can hand it off to an amoebocyte, and the amoebocyte will digest it and then take the nutrients to another cell in the sponge's body. Okay, so two different pathways that it can take. Okay, but basically the point of this is that all of the digestion that happens inside of a sponge is going to be intracellular, okay, meaning inside of the cell, okay? Inside of a cell. It is. Okay, so intracellular, inside of a cell. And notice again, no mouth, right, and no digestive tract. It's all going to just happen inside of cells. Sponges have to filter an incredible amount of water to get just like a little bit of food. So they have to filter about 1 ton of water to get 1 ounce of food, okay, because the food that they're eating is that small. So 1 ounce would be about the size, maybe a little bit less than this Jolly Rancher right here, okay? So that's how much food they get from filtering 1 ton of water, okay? Not very much. So they are perpetually pumping, perpetually filtering, and getting their food. Okay, so that flow of water as it goes through their body is also going to be acting as their respiratory, part of their respiratory system, their excretory system, and also their circulatory system. All right. So as water comes in, it's going to bring oxygen with it into the cells of the sponge, and as it moves through the sponge, it will pick up carbon dioxide and metabolic waste, and as it exits out the osculum, it takes it away. So it's part of the respiratory and excretory system. It's also part of the circulatory system because it can pass around that oxygen and get rid of those waste products, which is one of the jobs of your circulatory system. Okay, so water exits out the osculum. All right. Okay, so that water moving through the sponge, okay, will be one of the things that will actually determine how big a sponge can get. Okay, so sponges need energy in order to grow, just like any living thing. And so in order to get energy, they need to be able to feed and get lots of food. And the 2 things that will affect the amount of food that they get are their ability to pump water, how much water they can pump, and how much folding they have in their bodies. Okay, so it makes sense. If you are able to move more water through your body, then you are able to get more food. Right, you filter more food. If for folding, okay, the higher amount of folding that you have in a sponge's body, the more chances that you have to get food. So think of it like this way. Let's say that I'm wearing a vest that has $100 bills attached to it. Okay, and so I'm going to line you up in 2 lines. Okay, I'm going to run through the middle of you, and you'll have the opportunity to grab the $100 bills off and make money. Okay, would you rather that I lined you up in 2 straight lines where I can just sprint right through, or in 2 curvy lines where I have to then stop and pivot and stop and pivot and keep going? Number 1, because I'm not very agile, and number 2, do you think that would slow me down? Yeah. Okay. And would you have more opportunities to grab $100 bills if I had to go back and forth? Yes. Same idea with the sponge. The more folding they have inside their bodies, the more chances they get to capture food, the larger they can be. All right? Does that connection make sense? Okay. So you have 3 different body shapes of sponges. Asconoid, that's the simplest one. Okay, that's what we've been looking at up to this point. Syconoid, and then leuconoid. Okay. Syconoid, more folding. Okay, so this is the medium-sized body plan. You'll actually look at this one today. And then the leuconoid, these are the biggest types of sponges. This would be a leuconoid body shape. The biggest sponge ever, goodness, well, there's sponges, like vase sponges that you could probably sit in. So yeah, they're large. Sponges that you could sit in. Yes. Mermaids sit in giant clams. Okay. Reproduction. How do sponges reproduce? Yes, with broadcast spawning. So sponges are simultaneous hermaphrodites, meaning they are both male and female at the same time. Okay. So they will produce both eggs and sperm eggs that will remain inside of the sponge's body, okay, and they will broadcast their sperm into the water. That's why it's called broadcast spawning. Okay, they release it into the water. So they release the sperm into the water, and the water currents carry the sperm around until it gets to another sponge. Okay, and once it gets into the sponge, fertilizes the egg. Okay, we'll create a little larva. The larva will be released into the water for a neuroplankton stage of life before it eventually settles down and grows into a new sponge. Okay, so sexual reproduction because you've got two sets of DNA that are being combined. All right. So we'll talk about broadcast spawning a lot. There's lots of different kinds of animals in the ocean that will use the broadcast spawning method. Asexual reproduction. Okay. Sponges can do budding. So they can grow the little mini-me off their side and it can drop off and become a new sponge. Or they will also do fragmentation. So, and extreme forms of fragmentation like we were talking about. Or they can do this form of asexual reproduction where they produce these things called gemmules. Okay? What those are is sponges will take and put a bunch of amoebocytes into this little group, and they'll surround it with spicules to protect it because spicules can be sharp. And then they release that into the water column, and that can float around kind of like a spore. And then when conditions are right or better than they were, okay, it'll settle down and become a new sponge. But it's asexual reproduction because there's no new genetic information introduced. Okay. Ecology of sponges. So what do? Well, sponges live in dark places, so a lot of times sponges are actually found in the deep sea or like lower places on reefs where there's not a whole lot of light. They also provide shelter and food for other organisms, like we talked about. Okay. Sponges can also have symbiotic relationships with bacteria. So sponges, particularly those that live on coral reefs, will have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria where the bacteria will do photosynthesis and give the sponge oxygen and nutrients, and then the sponge's waste products will be used by the bacteria. So it's a mutualistic relationship, right? Sponges can also clean up the ocean floor. So you actually have this stuff that's called marine snow, which is pieces of mucus that get produced by animals that a bunch of stuff sticks to. Eventually it gets so heavy that it falls to the seafloor, and it literally looks like it's snowing underwater. Okay, so it's called marine snow, and sponges can filter some of that out and clean up the ocean floor that way. They can also produce toxic chemicals. So sponges, if you think about it as an animal that doesn't move and doesn't respond, okay, that if it doesn't have any way to protect itself, it's going to be eaten like nobody's business in the ocean, okay, because everything will want to eat it. Just these lovely, delicious cells hanging out there with no way to protect itself, it would be gone. Luckily for the sponge, it actually has a way to protect itself, and it will produce chemicals that taste bad to other animals, so they won't eat them. Also, their spicules can provide some protection because the spicules are sharp, and so things don't want to munch on a mouthful of needles. All right. So sea turtles are one of the only things that can actually eat sponges. So because they have tough mouths to be able to eat those spicules. Also, here's something that's really cool. Sponges produce chemicals to prevent other sponges from settling around them. So these chemicals that they produce prevent cells from growing. Okay, they prevent the sponges from growing. We're actually using a bunch of chemicals that are produced by sponges in cancer research, because if you have a chemical that prevents cells from growing, what is the problem with cancer? Cells that grow too fast, right? So if you have a chemical that can prevent that, maybe the cure for cancer will come from a sponge. You never know. Wouldn't that be cool? So you never know. Okay. You can also use sponges for baths. Okay? That's like the one that I passed around, or like loofahs. So that's what you can use them for. Here's a couple different kinds that you can find. And they will also produce antiviral and antibacterial chemicals as well. Okay. So throughout these next couple of units, I'm going to do like specimen spotlights, where we can't talk about all of the different kinds of animals that are in each phylum. So I'll kind of highlight the really cool ones. So like next cycle, I'll do one on the Portuguese man of war, right? And the box jellyfish and stuff like that, okay? But this one is the Venus flower basket. This is a deep sea sponge. It's a glass sponge. This is what it looks like, okay? It's a glass sponge. So its spicules are made out of glass. It makes their spicules out of glass. And they all connect and fuse together. And this is what it looks like, okay? What? So it's a glass sponge. Its spicules are fused together, and their spicules are actually fiber optic. Okay, so you can actually pass light through their spicules, and it travels through them. And so they're actually using these spicules as like researching fiber optics. What can we do to improve our fiber optics? And kind of cute, kind of creepy, but these are actually given to newly married couples in Asian cultures. So because they have these little shrimp that live inside of them. So they have like a male and a female shrimp that mate for life. And when they're small, they swim through one of the little holes of the sponge, and they live inside of the sponge for protection. Eventually, they grow too large to get out. So, and they spend their whole life in that sponge together, and then they die in that sponge together. So it's given as a gift, like, you know, till death do you part. May your marriage last forever, kind of deal. So, yeah, dead shrimp in a sponge is a gift for a wedding.